Right, I think we will get going. So first of all, welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. So this is the third and final webinar in our Cyber Essentials series. So my name's Nick Warrilow. I am a director in our dispute resolution and public law regulatory teams at Burness Poole, and I am part of our cyber security team. So our final webinar today is themed around risk mitigation for cyber. So I'm very happy to be chairing this today, and I'm joined by two panelists. So first of all, we have Paddy Tomkins, who joins us from Droman Solutions. Now, Paddy specializes in providing immersive training to help support frontline responders deal with cyber attacks and cyber incidents. And he focuses particularly on contingency planning and business continuity. Paddy is a former Chief Inspector of Police and Chief Constable of Lothian and Borders, and was also formerly a chair of the Scottish Business Resilience Centre for 4 years. And I'm also joined today by Hazel Moffat, who is a partner in our public law and regulatory team, and also part of our cyber security team. Now, anyone who's attended earlier webinars in this series will know that Hazel normally chairs these events, but she's swapped roles this week. So I'm going to be chairing, and Hazel will be talking in particular through risk mitigation, dealing with key stakeholders and affected parties. And that's based on her extensive experience of supporting many UK and international clients dealing with cyber attacks, and also as her role formerly as a legal advisor to the UK ICO. Now, just before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. Please can you mute yourselves during the session, but please do feel free to use the chat function to ask any questions or put any comments to our speakers or the wider group, and we'll try and pick those up as we go along and try and weave them into the sort of wider Q&A panel discussion session, which we'll have towards the end of the session. And as before, we're going to be recording this session, and the recording will be available afterwards. The session should last about an hour, and for anyone who needs CPD points, we can send out details to you for your records. Now, moving on to today's session, cybersecurity remains, as always, a hot topic. Some of you will have seen yesterday's news that JD Sports was subject to a very serious major cyber attack that affected almost 10 million customers whose data has been compromised as a result of that. Now, that follows obviously recent attacks on Royal Mail and the Guardian as well. As ever, it therefore remains imperative that businesses get their basics right in mitigating the risks of an attack and being as prepared as they can be should an attack occur. Now, we covered in our previous sessions preparatory steps for businesses to take, in particular putting in place cyber insurance, good data practice, the importance of engaging external advisors as early as possible, and implementing robust instant response plans and training sessions. Now, recordings of those sessions are available to watch. But today we're moving on to risk mitigation, and particularly focusing on building resilience and steps in responding to a cyber incident should one occur. So I'm going to hand over first of all to Paddy, who's going to talk us through some of his experience in building resilience. And starting on that theme, Paddy, please could you provide our attendees today with your current view on the question of resilience and how organizations should be dealing with it? And in particular, I think everyone would be interested to hear your thoughts on what businesses are getting right in terms of what you're seeing and what they're not, or possibly what they're not doing enough of. Paddy, I'm not sure, I can't hear you. I'm not sure if you're muted. No, unfortunately, I can't hear you at the moment, Paddy. I'm not sure if we have Katrina or Enya, if anyone's available to help us out on the sound.
Yeah, I think maybe on this one, Paddy, if you want to just rejoin the meeting just quickly. Hazel, we can always jump to you if you want, if that makes sense. And then we can let Paddy rejoin. Yeah, not sure what's happened there, but hopefully we'll get Paddy back soon.
Okay. Sorry, apologies everyone for that. Hazel, do you want to or hand over to you now and then we can loop Paddy in later?
Absolutely. Thank you, Nick, and welcome everybody. So one of the things that we see as lawyers helping clients manage kind of cyber risk and incidents is, I guess, good and bad points around how they deal with what I call kind of key stakeholders. And for the purposes of today, I've kind of grouped them in what are the most common categories. So that's regulators, affected individuals, affected business customers and partners, the media and internal teams. And I'm going to talk through a few of our observations and experiences in terms of what are the issues that crop up in each of those categories and how organizations can better handle some of the risks that come with dealing with those individuals. So as Nick said, I am a former legal advisor at my previous firm to the UK Information Commissioner. And we've spent a lot of time both speaking to them about the way in which they manage incidents and look into whether or not something should be investigated with possible enforcement action. But also, as a team, we do a lot of work with clients in dealing with the ICO. And it's interesting that there's a fairly new ICO, John Edward, and his latest mantra is the biggest cyber risk is complacency, it's not hackers. And that's something you really see feeding through a lot of the ICO decisions around fines for organizations not having sufficient procedures and risk mitigation for cyber attacks. I'll come on to that shortly. So one of the top tips, and for anyone that's suffered a kind of data breach or cyber attack, I am sure that you do this, but it's always worth stating the obvious. You have to notify the ICO of any data breach. So that's where there's been a breach or a cyber attack involving personal data, whether it's staff or customers or clients. You must notify the ICO within 72 hours of the breach or you becoming aware of the breach. So early notification. And actually, if you can go faster than 72 hours, even better. And one of the observations we would make about that notification requirement is clients quite often don't know what has happened within that time frame. There is still a lot of work ongoing, usually through cyber consultants or IT support, to work out exactly what the attack means, exactly what data is potentially compromised or has been taken, and what's being done with that. And that's becoming more and more of a challenge as the data that we hold gets more and more complicated. And so we quite often see clients saying, well, we don't want to update or notify the ICO because we don't know what to say. So the first error is they delay. They delay until they know more, or they delay until they have a kind of a better story. And our advice is don't delay. The ICO wants to know as soon as possible if anything like this has happened. It's a legal requirement, but it's good practice. I know from past experience that the ICO hated a situation where it became a media story that a big organization had been hacked, and they were quite often approached for quick comments. And they didn't know about it. They learned about it through the media. So that's not the position you want to be in. And the ICO is pragmatic. It deals with notifications every day. It sees the pattern. It entirely understands that within 72 hours, what you're dealing with is still unfolding. So early notification, even if it's quite high level, quite basic, but with a commitment to come back and keep updating, I think is the kind of key point that we would say. And also clients sometimes can want to tell the ICO everything about what they know about the attack. And again, with kind of cyber consultants and legal advisors, there are some key points that the ICO will want to know. They will want to know potentially how many files are affected and what type of data could be affected. But a really important point that actually we see clients quite often forgetting in this notification is to also be really clear up front and talk about what you have done to stem or contain or mitigate the attack. Have you taken your systems offline? Are you rebuilding them slowly? are there other things that you're doing to get your systems back online safely? So in other words, you've contained the risk and you've dealt with the risk, and you still need to deal with some of the consequences of that, but actually your systems are back online safely, or there's a plan to get them back online safely. So that's a really important point to think about. Two or three other points that I would say in terms of engagement with the ICO is quite often clients will put in a report to the ICO and hear nothing back. And there's either an assumption that everything's fine and the ICO doesn't care, or that no other updates need to be given. The ICO has a huge workload and will quite often not always respond. They may respond by giving you a case officer. That case officer may be quite interactive, but quite often they're not. Keep updating the ICO. If you're going to commit to a time frame, stick to it, even if there's nothing material to update. And if there is a case officer assigned to you, try and make contact with that case officer. They won't be influenced, unfortunately, but they can quite often give some good feedback, or they can direct you as to what they want to know that you're doing. And so it shows a level of cooperation. So some case officers are more experienced than others, but I think that type of relationship building and engagement is a useful thing to have. So yeah, keep the ICO and actually other regulators. I'm focusing very much on the ICO, but other regulators are very similar and quite often look to the ICO in terms of what you're telling them is what you should be telling us. So keep a level of consistency between the updates to different regulators where you can. It's easier for yourself to manage as well. And continue to keep the regulators, and including the ICO, updated in terms of, we talked a little bit about the systems update and what you're doing there in terms of mitigation. But really importantly as well, there's a good news story sometimes in terms of if you're going out to individuals to explain what data of theirs might be affected and what mitigatory measures they should be putting in place. I'll come on to that in a second. Tell the ICO that you're doing that. Explain to them how you're engaging with people. I've seen clients be in situations where the ICO will quite often come back and say, how many customers have you contacted and how many have contacted you to ask for follow-up or more advice? So keep that kind of audit trail, keep those statistics, because that can be quite helpful to show the ICO how well you have managed those stakeholders. And we see clients quite a lot now offering things to customers who'd affected. It could often be kind of complimentary credit and web monitoring services. There could be other things. It could be advice lines. It could be access to customer service support. Tell the ICO all of that, because again, that builds a picture of a responsible data controller, of a responsible organization, and it helps show that you're taking the right steps. And the more that you can show that, the more the ICO will probably recognize that whilst there may be some investigatory measures they need to put in place, that actually this is an organization that's reacted well. And that can go to the level of fine that you may be facing in future if the ICO decides it is in that category of an incident that requires some kind of fining. So mitigation is really important at this point, and the ICO is very big on wanting transparency from an organisation. So brief whistle stop tour of that. Affected individuals. Again, really what we're talking about is similar to the ICO, but it can be quite tricky, which is early notification. And back to the point that I said at the start, it's difficult as something is unfolding to really understand the extent of who might be affected and what data might be affected. And we've certainly worked with clients where that unfolded for several weeks, but we got to a point where we said, you really need to go out and notify everyone who may be affected, because there are measures they could be taking now to monitor their bank account, to change their passwords. And you should be allowing those individuals to take that kind of mitigatory action, even though you might find out in a few months' time or a few weeks' time their data is not actually compromised. But early notification is better. And actually, I'm sure we've all seen it when we've logged on to accounts. We quite often will see a pop-up that says, you know, this password may have been compromised. We would encourage you to change it, etc. So those kinds of early notifications are happening more and more now as organizations are sadly becoming slightly more accustomed to dealing with this. Key other points for affected individuals. is when you're giving that early notification, where you can, and this is the balance between trying to give them accurate information at an early stage and not perhaps concerning them too much when you don't know the full picture, but trying to give them an idea of what data of theirs you hold. So for example, is it name and address only? Is it identity documents? Is it bank account details? Is it credit card details? They're quite often the typical categories of organizations that they might hold data. So again, really important to try and give individuals a bit of visibility of the categories that they would hold. Again, it helps them to take those kind of mitigatory steps. One of the challenges of going out with early notification is, of course, you'll probably end up being inundated if we're talking about tens of thousands in particular, which we quite often are in these incidents. You could be inundated by calls, by emails, by individuals who want more information, particularly at that early stage if you can't be sure what you might be looking at. And so one of the things that we've worked with clients on, and we see more and more, is the need to get a plan in place in terms of a customer service hotline with trained individuals who understand what individuals have been told, understand what information can be shared, and in particular can point them to whether it's credit monitoring, if the company is going to offer that for free, or any other resources, or potentially bank hotlines where the banks quite often will help and step in a major breach, and also help in terms of password control and account monitoring. So really important that you set up a system where you can cope with a lot of people phoning up, because there's nothing worse, and the ICO will come down quite hard where you go out to a large number of affected individuals and there's no plan in place to deal with their follow-on queries. We're working with an organization at the moment who are, for example, using a call center managed by a third party, who've got a script, who've got FAQs, to help with that resourcing, because the organization itself just doesn't have the resources to do that at this point in time. So quite a big investment and something they've put in place. But I think, again, back to the thinking of managing the impact on individuals and managing the relationship and the presentation of how you've reacted to this to the ICO, that's a really good thing to do. So moving on to this really is a whistle stop tour. Moving on to the third category of affected business customers and partners. There are two kind of categories of data here that are affected. There's obviously where businesses have provided individual and personal data to an organization, and therefore that's very similar to what we've just discussed, other than you may have a business partner that is concerned that it could be on the hook for regulatory action or criticism by customers because they are a business partner of yours and they share some kind of risk in terms of how data has been handled. So that's something you need to think carefully about, and quite a lot of contractual arrangements will have something in place around protocols where there is a data breach or a cyber attack that affects your business partner's personal data or data of their customers. And quite often we see client organizations end up having to negotiate. So a lot of resource can be directed to having to negotiate with business partners who will all want to potentially contact joint customers in different ways, or have a different approach to call centers or FAQs or complementary web monitoring or credit monitoring. And so again, an idea would be to when entering into contracts where there is a lot of shared personal data or personal data that somebody is processing on behalf of a customer, have those conversations before the contract is signed. Have that discussion of how you're going to work together if an incident like this occurs, because the resources are so constrained when trying to deal with and unpick an incident. It can be quite difficult to manage that. A couple of points that are quite often forgotten about. Business data is quite often held. We had an organisation we dealt with a year or so ago where they did a lot of work for the public sector, a lot of work for government departments. A lot of information they held wasn't personal data, but it was highly sensitive government data and classified data, and in some cases highly regulated data. And so again, there was a lot of engagement with the government clients, the business clients, to understand partly in terms of the contracts, what was required of them in terms of notification, but also what other things were going to have to be dealt with. And so there we saw a very long period of government clients coming in and essentially peer reviewing everything that the organisation was doing in the aftermath of the cyber attack to understand, were their systems secure? Could we continue to do business with you? Were you a safe pair of hands? And then some clients have had 6-month or yearly audits, which government clients are entitled to do usually under contracts, but very much pressing on your cyber resilience. Have you addressed everything that was a risk? Have you addressed everything that we've identified as something that we're not happy about? So this can go on for a period of time. And I think people quite often forget that it's not just personal data you can be looking at in terms of, potential liability and the need to mitigate risk, but it can be business data, particularly when you're holding sensitive business data for private sector clients, but also in particular sensitive data for government clients. Media. Managing the media is a huge resource headache, actually. And again, it's something that we'd always encourage clients to be prepared for, whether it's having some basic statements, having media training for anyone within an organisation who may end up being a spokesperson, because actually that has huge reputational consequences and potentially huge loss of custom. We've seen a lot of organisations over the years whose share price has been massively affected by their mishandling in the media of a cyber attack. And very briefly, you'll remember TalkTalk CEO a number of years ago went on Newsnight, Dido Harding, to talk about cyber attack and was really ill prepared, I think, for the grilling that she got and her inability to control the narrative in that particular environment and ended up leaving. And TalkTalk really struggled to get back from that. Contrast this with a couple of years later, an organisation called Norsk Hydro, which is a major global producer of aluminium, suffered a major cyber attack, and so gave daily kind of podcasts and media updates through its social media channels, which it controlled, so very voluntary, telling its business partners and customers and individuals affected what it was doing, what was coming up, what they could do in terms of mitigating risk, what the organisation was going to offer them in terms of complementary services, etc. And so that's always held up as a really good example, and there's lots of coverage on it if you want to go and look at it more. Really good example of the kind of ultimate transparency to the public in the way it handled this. But the key point there is it didn't put anyone up to be interviewed by a journalist. It kept control of its own webcasts and its own media updates. So that's a really good point. A really critical point that clients quite often get wrong is they will either tell a lot more to the media, quite often by accident, because they've maybe not contained whoever's speaking on their behalf. They'll tell a lot more to the media than they do to the ICO, which can be a real problem, or to their business partners, or even individuals affected. So try and keep your communications with the media in particular consistent with what you're telling other people, and certainly don't go out to the media earlier than you're going out to the other stakeholders in this particular grouping. Finally, internal teams. This is a really interesting one because there's two things to consider here. The first is, of course, your staff may also be affected. Their personal data, payroll, medical information, working patterns, that information could of course be compromised. And so there is of course a need to treat your individual staff members rather like individual customers in terms of the way you manage some of the communications. And that can be quite easily forgotten about when you're thinking kind of constantly about the external dimension. But one thing we've noticed more and more that's actually a really big risk that isn't very often talked about is the fact that your internal teams at a time of huge business pressure and change quite often still have to go about their day-to-day work. And that's where systems are down. Some systems may not be accessible, certain information may not be accessible. And what we've seen with a lot of organisations recently, and what I've had own personal experience of, is a real desperation for the business to get back to normal, business as usual, but having to do it with one hand behind their back, with systems which are compromised or down or not all in operation. And so what do humans do? They try and create workarounds. They try and still deliver for the company, for their clients, and they create workarounds. And we've seen quite a lot of recent examples where client staff have tried to create workarounds in good faith with the best possible intentions, but those workarounds have created their own data protection or cyber risks. So for example, doing things through private email accounts because your email account is done, not using encrypted information, sending files through less secure means, unencrypted, that type of thing. And that is completely understandable, but it's really important that an organization accepts that risk will be there and to get staff together to talk about those risks and what we're going to do. And it may involve, saying to staff, we're just not going to be able to do certain things, and we accept that as an organization, or this is how we're going to try and deal with this workaround, and these are the protections we're going to put in place. And a few years ago, I was in an organization that suffered a pretty significant cyber attack. All of our systems were down. And we had what we called kind of daily town hall meetings, where for about a period of about 3 or 4 weeks, we all got together and talked about what information we couldn't access. It was a headache, and we tried to get kind of global solutions, what things that people were working out that we could do safely, and we shared those. It's a real challenge for your business teams. And so I think don't lose sight when you're trying to handle all these other risks that are going on. Don't lose sight that there could be new and different risks that the organization might have to face, with all the best intentions, where teams are simply trying to do their day job in incredibly different circumstances. So real whistle stop tour. Nick, I'm going to hand back over to you, and then I'll let you hand back on to Paddy, but very happy to take any questions in the Q&A on any of that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Hazel. Definitely a couple of points would be good to follow up on. And just a reminder to everyone that if you have any questions, please put them in the chat function and we will try to cover them off. Hopefully, Paddy, your sound issues are resolved, and we can turn to you now.
Can you hear me?
I can. Yes.
Excellent. Splendid.
So can we just pick up on the concept of resilience, which is something you focus on? And so as I was posing the question previously, it'd be good to get your take on what companies are getting right and what they're doing wrong in terms of cyber resilience.
Sure. I think much of what I would say, or some of what I say, will definitely echo and reinforce some of the points that Hazel's made. Certainly our experience working with public sector and private sector organizations is that leadership is critical, absolutely critical, where the problem of not just cybersecurity, but security across the piece, from digital network security to asset management, to access control, to human resources and so on, because they're all interlinked, where that is owned by the chief executive and the board, and where that message is conveyed to the organization as a whole, then there is a starting of a development of the culture of security and the behaviors that reinforce that: clean desks, access control systems, and so on. Where that isn't apparent, then I would say it is characterized, those organizations are characterized by a degree of complacency. The worst end of that spectrum is the plan is not to have a plan and simply hope, and those organizations do exist. Or even quite sophisticated organizations will be using dated kit or systems. They'll be running or obsolete operating systems on the laptops their staff are using, which in itself sends a message to the workforce about the value placed on the digital realm. The concept of security and resilience is not built into business processes. It's seen as an overhead. There's no real shared sense of the organization's capability as to how it will respond to a major event. We're obviously here talking about cyber breaches, but it can be any kind of major disruption to business, including natural disaster, and a lack of investment in training. Of course, I would say that, wouldn't I? Because I come from a training supply background, but the reality is that investing in training reflects an investment in individuals who work within the organization. And that is reciprocated in terms of attention, understanding, curiosity about the nature of the problems. I'd say also the characteristics of the better organizations are those who've gone through the process that Hazel made reference to, which is understanding what the threats and risks are, what they have that others would be, the bad actors would be interested in. Personal data, talked about at length, commercially sensitive data, intellectual property, work with an offshore engineering company where the intellectual property of their engineering solutions is the most critically important information they have in their marketplace. And of course, again, as Hazel emphasized very eloquently, reputation, market confidence, regulator confidence, customer confidence, that is a major risk to organizations, trading organizations particularly. So where there is a real an articulated understanding of those factors in the organization, it's much more effective in helping people understand what they can do to mitigate those risks, to protect the valuables they have in that regard. So understanding what they have to protect and understanding what might be the main vectors for seeking to attack, diminish, damage those assets. And I'll just make one more point before I come back to you. Again, what I think characterizes the most effective organizations are those that are taking reasonable steps. Again, Hazel's referred to the expectations, the regulators. An organization that is going through a cycle of planning, exercising, debriefing, and restarting again at the planning cycle is much more resilient, is much more self-aware in the event of a major breach, disaster, interruption of business, what it might be. It allows people at all levels to make mistakes safely. It allows the leadership level to effectively put themselves on offer with their junior colleagues and learn together. It builds confidence, it builds a sense of team, and I think crucially, it improves response time. It's like any kind of exercise. It improves the muscle memory of response, knowing what to do. There will always be a moment of being dazed by the event, but that moment can be minimized by people slipping into an automated routine. Of course, this is something that the emergency services, the armed services do all the time. They go into a well-rehearsed response. Every situation will be different, but there will be a planned structure that people know what they're doing and what their colleagues are doing. And that will also, I think, create resilience to the kinds of challenges, subsequent challenges that, again, Hazel referred to, whether that's from a regulator, whether it's later on in court, whatever it might be, a public inquiry at the worst possible end of the spectrum. The basic questions: did you plan? Did you train? Did you exercise? Did you stick to the plan? And if not, why not? And if you can answer those questions and you've got a reason for why you didn't stick to the plan, you did something else, then they amount, in my view, to reasonable steps. I don't think anyone's expecting a perfectly secure and resilient situation, but steps can be taken to optimize the response. And I can talk further, but I've probably talked for long enough. Nick, so you might want to interrupt me.
So just picking up on that final point about preparation. We covered preparation and have covered it so far in our series. It would be interesting just to get your thought on some really practical examples of what you think constitutes good preparation from what you've seen and your direct experience of dealing with businesses. Are there any particular tips in terms of training programs or other preparations that you've seen you've demonstrated excellent sort of practical focused preparation?
Yeah, okay. I think this could be a full hour lecture in itself. I don't want to burden you with that, but yeah, certainly. I mean, key steps. I come back to the leadership issue. Appoint an owner. People need to know who is the center of expertise. Too often that's relegated to the IT department or technology department, whatever it might be. It isn't a technology issue. It's a security, cultural, and behavioral issue within the organization. And it should be brigaded with those other preparation for those other threats they've talked about: natural disasters, power outages, all those possibilities. So someone who owns that at a senior level and has access to the board, as well as the ability to engage with other people in the organization at all levels, that's crucial. Planning, I've talked about, plans with version control, constant revisiting that, a scheduled revisiting of the planning process. Where designated individuals are going to take a leadership role in the response, then directing them to use what I would call a policy book tool is, and this is something that's used by senior investigators in major disasters, homicides, and so on. It's a basic recording of decision making, when the decision was made, why it was made. Doesn't have to be the right decision. It might often not be, but it's showing the rationale to any subsequent inspection of the response to a particular incident. I come back again to the point about exercise. We practice fire drills. It's something that should be exercised. It's something that people should be made to feel is relevant to their role, whatever their role is in the organization. And I literally mean everybody from the cleaners and the security staff to the chief executive suite. Everyone has a role in supporting the culture of security. Again, I think Hazel used the phrase peer review. Regular self-assessment, if done with outsiders who have an objective view, all the better. But a self-assessment process that draws also on external sources of information like the National Cybersecurity Centre, which has got excellent resources freely available publicly online. Peer review from people elsewhere in the organisation or from professional experts, such as Burness Poole in this case. Think about structured processes like gaining Cyber Essentials accreditation, which again helps with the self-assessment process. So really learning from the experience of others, learning from the experience of experts like yourselves here today, and constantly reiterating that process. It can't be, it has to be, I don't really like the cliche of a living document, but it has to be that. It has to be something that's constantly revisited and kept alive and kept at the forefront of people's minds. I know it's hard. People have got a day job, as has been said, but understanding that they have a role in the event of extreme circumstances makes recovery so much more effective and more speedy.
Right. I mean, it's very interesting to hear that, because it's very much in line with what we've heard so far in this series.
I'm relieved to hear that.
Yeah. On the point that you've made, you said everyone has a role. It's not an IT issue, and equally, it's not a board issue. So you've talked about a training program, the importance of training program involving everyone across the business. How else do you go about getting that engagement from every level of the business in terms of making sure that everyone understands what their role is and how that role fits into the wider picture? Yeah,
I mean, it has to, the training, as you say, has to be tailored for different roles. If people start seeing something as irrelevant to them, they're going to switch off. It's somebody else's job, which is why, certainly from my experience, we emphasize training, then exercising, because it allows people to exercise their role in partnership with others, simultaneously with others, at different levels of seniority in the organization. So they're all seeing an organizational response rather than an individual response. Particularly good training, and this is why we in particular work with the Scottish computer game industry and Abertay University in Dundee, who are expert world leaders in computer game technology. The ability to give people a really immersive experience, to make it feel, to get the physiological cues to a stressful situation is very valuable in heightening the learning experience. But that also allows us, that technology allows us to build a very rich suite of analytics that allows us to know how capable the organization is as a whole, what areas people are finding difficult at different levels of the organization, are there particular aspects that people don't understand well. So to be able to shape things, again, it's an iterative process, it's a constant revisiting, and it's also something that should be supplying people with something they can turn to in extremis. I don't like, well, I sometimes use the phrase sheep dip training. Somebody who did their training 6 months ago on an e-learning platform, who is then suddenly presented with a problem, they need a resource to go to. They need some sort of aid memoir, some refresher information, or a basic series of response steps that will allow them to help start stabilizing the situation. And that can be built into not just a training, but an informing process.
And how you talked about the importance of training, of getting people used to you said the physiological effects of of an incident, how, from your experience, how can a company prepare itself practically for what may hit them? And in particular, not only in terms of immediately how they respond, but given that the business will be continuing, the level of disruption will continue for quite some time.
Yeah.
You can't distill that in an hour-long training session. So how can a business prepare itself for the long haul it may face?
You're absolutely right. You can't, which again is why you supplement the training with exercise in the practice. We can learn the rules of a game, but we actually have to go and play the game and play it repeatedly to become accomplished in it. And this is a similar process. So yes, it's a cost. I fully recognise that. But if you look at the emergency services, the armed services, critical national infrastructure, offshore services, they will constantly exercise danger routines, threats, the sort of emergency responses to particular situations. And so is true for the health service. That practice, it gives rich information on the capability of the organisation and individuals. It boosts personal confidence, it boosts a sense of team, it boosts a shared understanding of purpose. So I know I've repeated it several times now, and I can't repeat it too frequently or emphasise it too strongly. The exercise process is critical, whether it's a 2-hour exercise, an hour's exercise, something that, or indeed a whole day in some circumstances. That really is time and money well spent. If I could just go on to the second part of your question, which is, if it does go wrong, how are people going to respond? And you've talked about earlier about managing the media. Hazel talked about managing the media. Again, I think that's critically important, because if it's not managed effectively, it introduces additional stressors, particularly for the leadership level, that can be avoided. So yes, have a media engagement plan. Something I learned in the police, particularly when I was working in London, had to deal with the siege of the Greek embassy. The media are quicker, better resourced, and more ruthless than you. In whatever role you're in, anybody on this call, they are better, quicker, and more ruthless than you. If you don't take control, as Hazel said, they will. So you've got to feed them. You've got to feed them with information, but have structured press briefings, let them know when the news cycle is going to come to that particular time when they're going to get some information, control the narrative, because it will become extremely problematic if that isn't done. I think the other point I would make, and I'm not going to echo the point about regulators because that was made eloquently and forcefully, but plan for the long haul. Again, as Hazel referred to, this can take some time. If you've already designed through your plans fallback situations, fallback capabilities, backup capabilities, and so on, that will help a lot. Sometimes that might be an alternative operating base, alternative shadow operating system. It obviously depends on the nature of the organization and the size and capability of the organization. But what I would say is that whatever that capability, you also need to think about the long haul. The first 24 hours after a major breach, for example, everyone's running on adrenaline. It's great. Yeah, I can carry on working. I can carry on working. That really can't go on for more than 24 hours and becomes a risk in itself if allowed to. So there needs to be a plan about who is going to do what, particularly at the senior leadership level where there's so few of them, and how that is going to be sustained over the long term. I could also talk about further aspects of it, about bespoke people and so on, that Hazel briefly touched on, but think now about something that might last weeks and who is going to run that. The people running it might change, but certainly that first, let's say 24 to 72 hours is critically important. And knowing how the organization will sustain the right level of people, the right level of expertise throughout that is very important to the planning process.
And do you have any sort of practical tips on that in terms of how a company should go about planning its longer term response, both in terms of capacity and, I suppose, team structure and who would be involved?
Yeah, it's exactly that. As you imply, it's a logistical challenge. So that will involve the management of the networks, the management of the buildings. If it's a fleet type organization, then obviously the supply chain aspect, and crucially the people. So people should know, just as we know who the fire monitor or who's a first aider and so on in an organization, because we have to comply with health and safety organization, people should know what their role is. They should receive training for that role. They should have reference material for that role. And they might know that depending on the time the event takes place, they are the person who's on call for the night shift, or they are the person who's going to take the day shift the next day, and so on. So people slip very quickly into something, again, hopefully, if there's an exercise regime, they have practiced and they know what their role is, they know who their opposite number is, who their counterpart is, and they can slip into that structure. Again, inevitably, you need more than one or two people, self-evidently, because just as the gods of IT that decreed that my microphone wouldn't work at the start of this will also decree that somebody's going to be sailing their yacht around Corfu or whatever it might be when it happens. So you need to have that strength in depth. So the people need to be identified, they need to be earmarked for their roles, and they need to be trained and supported for those roles.
Okay, thank you, Paddy. That's really interesting to hear and very helpful. Maybe if we could loop Hazel back in just for the last 10 minutes or so. There are some really interesting themes coming out of this. Hazel, to pick up on a couple of points you made, you were talking about the ICO and you said they were pragmatic, and in many cases you often will send updates to them and not hear back. One of the key concerns of any business when it's hit by an attack will be the possibility of some form of regulatory enforcement or a fine down the line. So I suppose the question is how pragmatic is the ICO? How readily will it look to take some kind of action against a business? Or will it only be in a case of if there are very clear and very extreme steps that the business failed to take, that only in the clearest cases the ICO is going to step in?
Good question, hard to answer. Classic lawyer, it depends. I think there's 2 or 3 factors that I see quite regularly seem to influence being investigated and then being fined. And the first is that the size and scale of the attack, really, in other words, how many individuals' data has been impacted. That clearly is a top line issue. And so when you hear of some of the bigger fines, we're quite often talking about millions of individuals' data who's affected, but equally that in itself is not enough, of course, but that's one of the kind of ticks in the boxes in terms of it had a significant impact on individuals. The other thing that I think would be an issue is quite often you'll see ICO investigating and then fining where an attack has occurred, and 2 things: an organization hasn't been quick enough to spot it, or hasn't been quick enough to recognize the risks around it. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So Marriott, the hotel chain, were fined, I think, just over 18 million in 2018, I think. It's a quite a significant amount. I think we were talking about potential impact of 300 million guests worldwide, so huge. But the really kind of egregious point as far as the ICO was concerned was the fact that this was an attack that actually dated back to 2014. And so therefore there had been a kind of a threat actor in their systems undiscovered for, I think, the best part of 4 years. And it only really came to light when I think part of the Marriott hotel chain were to be sold off and due diligence was being done. And so the worst possible scenario really for them, in terms of huge amount of people affected for a very, very long period of time, nobody was told, and they didn't spot it. And it was a third party that had to come in and spot it. And likewise, BA had a similar issue where they were fined, I think, about 20 million. That was obviously headline news. That wasn't so much a cyber attack, it's just a data breach. And again, there was kind of 2 months of this issue occurring, and nobody noticed within BA, and it was a third-party provider that noticed. And in each of those occasions, and I'm sure if anyone's interested, they'll go online and have a look at the reports, the failure for the systems to flag up quickly is one thing, but the failure to then take that seriously and do the proper investigations, whether it's internal or external, is really important. There is another example, I think it was Ticketmaster, where they were fined quite a lot, again, well, millions. And the issue there was, I think they'd flagged up suspicious activity, and I think the internal team had done a kind of preliminary review and had spotted a patch that hadn't been dealt with properly, but it actually didn't spot the actual issue that had occurred and that had caused the cyber breach. And so again, they were criticised for, okay, you had an early warning, good, but then you failed to properly investigate it. And I think quite often the ICO will see a kind of capacity issue. So internal teams doing the initial investigation, and a lot of the internal cyber teams or IT teams in organizations are just not really experienced enough to identify. They'll identify some things, but not others. And so that's where, dare I say it, the kind of the external really experienced cyber forensics coming in can give you that experience. They know exactly where to look. They see these threat actors day in and day out. They have the kind of familiarity with their MO that IT teams don't have. And that's usually something that leads to a better outcome. So it's failure to spot that there's an issue, failure of your systems to identify it and stop it. But actually really significant criticism comes when you don't have the skills or get the skills in to actually work out where they've gone in your systems and what they've taken. So that's a real issue. And that seems to have caused some of the biggest fines that we've seen.
Yeah.
So when I say they're pragmatic, they're not that pragmatic. But they're pragmatic, I think, about an incident occurring. They're less pragmatic about what you do that's within your control after that.
I see. And it seems to me that there's a risk attached. You were talking earlier about the importance of engaging with regulators early, updating them, and providing details of what measures you're putting into place post an incident. Isn't there an inherent risk that the more information you share also suggests that there were deficiencies in the company's systems or procedures in the first place? So how does a company balance out the benefit of being open and sharing information with the potential flip side of that?
It's a good point. I guess there's a starting point you can't get away from, which is if you have suffered a cyber attack, something has gone wrong. And that something does not necessarily mean that you've not done everything you should have done, but something has gone wrong. And so that's the ICO starting point. They've got into your systems. So something has failed, but we may recognize that these threat actors have the intent to overcome almost all, not all reasonable precautions, but a lot of them. So you can't catch everyone. But then I think you're right. There's a need to be upfront about what you're doing, and the kind of remedial work and the mitigations you're putting in place is a real balancing. And I've seen some clients who have in internal reports that the ICO has eventually requested. An internal report has said, IT director angry to the board, I told you to invest in these systems. I had one hand behind my back. This was always going to happen. Right in the heat at the moment, and he had a valid point. But he wrote it down, and that information ended up in the hands of the ICO and potentially, I think, third parties. So one, be careful about what you say internally about the deficiencies in your system. But I think you have to balance out accepting that you're going to have to put mitigations and maybe take additional measures and put them in place. But it's not always a starting point that your systems were deficient to start with. I think learning that you can maybe do things. And, the last time that people looked at their systems, products move on, cybersecurity moves on. And it's, as Paddy's kind of said, and other speakers have said, it's a real journey that constantly needs to be looked at. So the idea that what was in place for the past year might have served you reasonably well, but what you need to do going forward might look different. Doesn't automatically mean that your systems were markedly deficient. But it is a challenge. And the starting point from the ICO is they got into your system. That is a starting point. So I think it is this balance of, look, we think our systems were good. We took all reasonable precautions. That's quite often a phrase that we see. But actually going forward, we're going to enhance our security. That's a phrase I often use. We're going to have enhanced protections. Not that we're suddenly going to have protections for the first time, but we're going to have enhanced protections. That's the kind of language that you quite often see. But it is a total balance. And I mentioned caseworkers are quite different. I've seen some caseworkers being quite pragmatic and quite, understanding of the challenges faced by business, and others being less so, to be honest.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'm conscious of time. We've got a couple of minutes left. Paddy, a slightly different question for you. With your current hat on, but also your previous hat in the police force, what's your view on company engaging with hackers, where so many of these incidents are ransomware attacks? What's your advice to companies who say, should we be engaging with these hackers, or is it something that you think a company should just steer clear of, full stop?
I would like to say philosophically the latter. I think that would be a little glib on my part. I think the reality is that every situation needs to be taken on its merits. And again, taking Hazel's point, the victim should be taking advice from the police, if the National Cybersecurity Centre are called in, from them, obviously from their professional advisors such as yourself, and be taking a considered view on that. The general position of policing, just as with kidnaps and ransoms of any kind, is that paying the ransom is going to perpetuate the problem. So, but in broad terms, but then the individual organization has got a problem here and now trying to unlock their data. So, it would be naive of me and disingenuous of me to say that people haven't paid their ransoms at the time and have got things unlocked. There's no guarantee of that. There is no guarantee that the payment of a ransom by crypto or whatever it might be will actually get the result that people think they're going to get, which is their data back. So it's a highly risky situation. And again, I would say, bring in the advisors, both the public authorities and professional advisors such as yourself, at the earliest possible stage to analyze the particular circumstances of the event. There is no glib answer that will fit all circumstances.
Okay, thanks. Right, we need to round up, but let me give you both one last chance for a final comment. You've both talked about complacency, the biggest risk being complacency. Are there any particular tips on how companies should be thinking of moving a mindset away from complacency towards proactive engagement with this issue?
Shall I go first?
Yeah, go ahead.
I quite often see clients who do an annual audit or annual training. And I think it picks up on something that Paddy was saying, which is, given the threats that businesses are facing, an annual audit or annual training is probably not enough. And I think, it's not a tick box exercise. And I think having small and often reminders that are quite practical for staff in particular is much better than having, a 3-hour online course that they do once a year, or one seminar that they go to once a year, or an audit that occurs only once a year. I don't think that's enough these days. I think the threats are so rapid and changing so quickly. I think it needs to be a constant monitoring by the organization, but kind of constant sharing of tips or best practice in bite-sized chunks to staff. So it's kind of constantly in their consciousness, as opposed to something they put in a drawer and forget about. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. All of the above. There is, I think, often complacency comes from a sort of paradoxical response or lack of confidence, that people don't understand the situation. They say, oh, I'm not a technology person, I leave that to the IT department or whatever. Again, I come back to the point, it is not an IT issue. It is a broad culture of security and resilience to the organization. And that, by any definition, in any organization, is a matter for the leadership. So, but I don't think the process of scaring people with all this happened, this company, and they got fined millions of pounds necessarily works. But I absolutely subscribe to what Hazel said about involving people in a process of practice and education. That builds confidence, that builds a degree of engagement with peers in the business community. And there are now well-structured, effectively mutual support groups in retail, in banking, in a whole range of sectors that are very powerful and well worth accessing. It builds that confidence and understanding of what the threat might look like and what might be the reasonable step to take to mitigate it. So complacency isn't always about completely dismissing a subject as irrelevant. Sometimes it's about, and often in my experience, about really not wanting to look silly, not look stupid, not show out, not look, to the junior staff or whatever. So a process that helps people engage with that in a way that is safe. And again, the planning, training, exercising program helps build that, is very important in my view.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time and we could keep talking on this subject for quite a while, but thank you very much, Paddy and Hazel, for your contributions today. And that brings us to the end of this Cyber Essentials series. It's been really fun to be part of, and thank you all very much for taking part. And I think a recording of this session will be available for everyone afterwards. But otherwise, thank you for attending and have a very good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.